All right, so keeping a lab notebook is something that you're going to do each week in lab. It's an important part of being a scientist. It's sort of like your own personal diary, but that's also shared with everybody else. So basically the lab notebook's purpose is so that you can go back in time and that you or others looking at it could determine exactly what experiment you did, under exactly what conditions, so that they could actually reproduce that experiment for themselves, or they could just look at exactly what you did, see what data you got, and use that so they don't have to repeat work that you've already done. For our lab notebooks, we want them to be bound with numbered pages, and we want them to have carbon copies. That way you can tear out a page and hand it into your instructor or TA for grading easily. Notebooks, I should also mention, are legal documents, so you do not own your lab notebook when you work in a research lab. Your lab owns it, and they will keep it when you leave the lab. And in terms of the courtroom, they can sometimes be brought in when there are patent disputes, and you have to prove when you actually made a discovery. All right, for the purposes of our labs though, once you have your lab notebook, you should put your name on it somewhere so that it's clear who it belongs to. And then always keep a table of contents. And you can see here an example table of contents where you put the page number and the experiment title. That way, when you have 200 pages of lab notebook, you can very quickly and easily find exactly the experiment you're looking for. That comes in handy when you're going on 2 years of using the same notebook. All right. For individual entries, you'll have something that looks like this. Here's an experiment where we were looking at, can we reduce the butter in mac and cheese without losing taste? So always have the date on a notebook entry and the title, and then begin it with the purpose. Why are you doing this experiment? Here we wanted to examine why can we reduce butter. So it doesn't have to be a specific hypothesis, but you definitely want to know, why was I doing this experiment? Okay, and then in the methods section, you should record enough detail so that somebody with just your lab notebook could reproduce your experiment if they wanted to. And I should mention, it's okay to refer back to old sections of your notebook. So if you're washing worms week after week after week, which you will, you don't have to write that whole protocol down each time. You can just refer to it, worms were washed, as on page 35, with the following exceptions, right, if anything was different for this particular week. After your exact methods, you'll have your data, right? Any data and any analyses that you record, you can, if you do analyses in Excel, you can always print out a copy of that table or, calculations that you did and just glue it in to your lab notebook. That's acceptable. And then conclusions. So what was the result of the experiment? Here I decided reducing butter to half of its called for amount seems to be okay, but no butter tasted really bad in our mac and cheese. So whatever you learn from your experiment, even if it's a giant failure, you usually learn something, right? We killed all of our worms, we think most likely by taking too long to wash them, right? Something like that. So always write what you learned from the experiment, what you're thinking of doing next, things like that. Okay, in terms of other things for your lab notebook that I want to mention, so never write in pencil. You should always be writing in pen, right? Pencil can be erased and changed later, which makes it not a legal document anymore. If you do make a mistake, never white it out, never completely cross it out, just mark a big X over it, so you've marked it as not something that should be read, but it is still there. You're not erasing any data potentially, right? Also, you'll be working with your lab partners, so it's completely fine to share data. If, for example, one person, keeps the big data table while you're doing the experiment, other people can take a picture of that and glue a picture of that into their lab notebooks, for example, and then just cite who you actually got that from. Now, quite often experiments go on beyond just a week, so when that happens, right, you can just say continued from page whatever on your notebook and write the new date. So you always want to have new entries for each day that you're coming into lab. So your experiments might sometimes be spread out. You might have your methods on one notebook page and then come back to that experiment, a few labs later. and just make it clear and obvious what experiment you're continuing on this day, and then you'll have, right, the data and conclusions on this page, and that would be okay. There's also a document on Blackboard with instructions on the notebooks that you can also refer to.